The lost time. Jessica had always been a city girl, but after a recent job promotion, the constant buzz of urban life became overwhelming. She decided to take a break at her family's farmhouse, miles away from civilization, surrounded by thick forests. She hadn't visited in years and thought the isolation would bring her some peace. One sunny afternoon, she ventured into the woods behind the house. With no cell service, she used an old-fashioned compass to guide her. The air was crisp, the forest floor soft beneath her feet. She walked for what felt like hours, enjoying the serenity, until she noticed something strange. Her watch had stopped. Jessica tapped the face of her watch, thinking it must be broken. But then she noticed the sun hadn't moved in the sky. Time, it seemed, had paused. Confused, she turned to head back to the farmhouse, but the path she came from had vanished. The trees seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, as though they were alive, guiding her deeper into the woods. Panic set in. She hurried in what she thought was the right direction, but after an hour of frantic walking, she realized she was lost. Worse, she began to hear whispers in the distance. Not human, but something else, something old and malevolent. The whispers were unintelligible, like a language from another world, but they grew louder, closing in on her. Jessica ran. The forest seemed endless, and no matter how far or fast she ran, the voices were always there. She stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin. Desperate, she entered, slamming the door behind her. Inside, everything was covered in dust, as if no one had been there for decades. She noticed an old mirror on the wall, cracked and weathered, but her reflection wasn't what she expected. In the mirror, she was older, much older. Her hair was streaked with gray, her skin wrinkled and pale. Jessica recoiled in horror, but when she looked down at her hands, they were still young. The whispers outside the cabin grew louder, now accompanied by distant footsteps. She looked back into the mirror, and her reflection smiled at her, though she hadn't moved. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open, and a gust of cold air blew through. Jessica felt herself being pulled towards the mirror, her reflection watching with a twisted grin. She screamed, but it was too late. The last thing she saw was her reflection reaching out and pulling her into the glass. The next day, local authorities found Jessica's body deep in the woods, aged beyond recognition. Her watch had stopped at the exact moment she had entered the forest, but no one could explain how she had aged over 60 years in the span of a few hours. The sound beneath the floor. Derek had always loved living in older homes. There was something charming about their creaky floorboards and antique architecture. After purchasing a turn-of-the-century house in upstate New York, he believed he had found his dream home, a sprawling Victorian-style building with a vast basement. Everything seemed perfect until he started hearing the noises. At first, it was subtle, a faint scraping sound coming from beneath the floor. Derek dismissed it as the house settling, something typical in older buildings. But as the days passed, the sound became more frequent and distinct, like something or someone was moving beneath him. One night, unable to sleep due to the persistent scraping, Derek grabbed a flashlight and headed to the basement. The air was damp and cold, with a lingering musty smell. He inspected the space, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Nothing seemed out of place until he reached the far corner. The sound was louder here, and it was accompanied by a soft tapping. Kneeling down, Derek pressed his ear to the floor. His heart raced as the noise became clearer, more deliberate. It wasn't just random movement. It was rhythmic, like a series of knocks, 1, 2, 3, then silence. Derek's mind raced. Maybe it was an animal trapped under the floorboards? Or worse, someone had been buried there long ago. He grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox and started prying up the old wooden boards. As he worked, the tapping grew louder and more frantic. Whatever was beneath him was aware of his presence. With the final board removed, Derek gasped. Below the floor was a narrow crawl space, and within it, he saw something horrifying. A pair of pale, human hands, bruised and bloodied, reaching up toward him. He jumped back, heart pounding. But when he shone his flashlight into the space, there was nothing there. The hands had vanished. Trembling, Derek lowered himself into the crawl space, shining his light in every direction. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and stretched under the entire house. That's when he saw it. On the far wall of the crawl space, etched into the dirt, were dozens of handprints, pressed deep into the soil as if people had been trying to claw their way out. And next to them, scrawled in a childlike script, were the words, "Still here." Derek scrambled out of the crawl space, sealing it up as fast as he could. But the sounds didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the tapping turned into pounding, the floorboards vibrating with each knock. His lights flickered, and shadows moved in corners where no one should have been. One night, as Derek lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming up from the basement. Slow, deliberate, each step heavier than the last. His door creaked open, and in the dim light he saw the outline of a figure, its hands bruised and bloodied, just like the ones in the crawl space. The next morning, Derek's neighbors found his house abandoned, the doors wide open. He had vanished without a trace, but the police found something chilling in the basement. A fresh set of handprints on the crawl space wall, and the words, "Still here," scratched into the floor. The disappearing roommate. Lily had always considered herself lucky when she found her apartment in Chicago. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was safe, and her roommate, Amy, seemed like the perfect match. They had met online through a roommate-finding app, and after a brief chat, decided to share the two-bedroom apartment. The first few months were uneventful. Lily and Amy had their own routines, rarely crossing paths except for the occasional movie night. But then, Amy started acting strange. She began staying in her room for days at a time, barely eating or talking. Lily figured Amy was going through something personal, so she gave her space. One night, Lily woke up to a strange noise, a faint scratching sound coming from Amy's room. Worried, she knocked on the door, but there was no response. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Fearing the worst, Lily tried the doorknob. It was locked. The next morning, Amy didn't come out of her room. When Lily came home from work, Amy's door was still closed. Concerned, she texted Amy, asking if everything was okay, but the message went unread. Lily decided to call the landlord, explaining the situation. He agreed to stop by the next day to check on things. When the landlord arrived, he unlocked Amy's door, and what they found inside was baffling. Amy's room was completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, no personal items. It was as if no one had ever lived there. The landlord stood in the doorway, speechless. "This is impossible," he muttered. "I signed the lease with her. She's been paying rent." Lily was confused and scared. Amy had been living with her for months, but now, it was as if she never existed. The landlord checked the building's records, only to find that there was no record of Amy ever signing a lease. Her name wasn't in the system, and none of the neighbors had ever seen her. Desperate for answers, Lily called the police. After a brief investigation, they found no trace of Amy's identity. No driver's license, no social security number, no birth certificate. It was as if Amy had never existed in the first place. That night, as Lily lay in bed, she heard the scratching noise again, this time louder. It was coming from Amy's empty room. Gathering her courage, she opened the door and stepped inside. The room was freezing cold, despite the heater being on. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. On the wall, faintly etched into the paint, were the words, "Help me. I'm still here." Lily's blood ran cold. She ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. But the scratching never stopped. Every night, without fail, it grew louder and more desperate. Eventually, Lily moved out, unable to bear the constant reminders of Amy. But no matter where she went, she could still hear the scratching, following her from one apartment to the next. The vanishing trail. Ryan was an avid hiker, always seeking out the most remote trails to escape the pressures of life in the city. So when he heard about a little-known trail in the Appalachian Mountains, he couldn't resist. The locals referred to it as the Lost Path, a trail that wasn't on any official map but was rumored to offer the most breathtaking views. One Saturday morning, Ryan set out to find the trail. The directions were vague, but after several hours of searching, he finally stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown path leading deep into the forest. The deeper he hiked, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, just an eerie, unnatural silence. After a few miles, Ryan noticed something unsettling. The trees around him were all the same, no variation in size or shape. It was as if he had been walking in circles, though his compass showed he had been heading in a straight line. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, barely visible through the trees, darted across the path. Ryan stopped, his heart racing. He called out, but there was no response. Just silence. He continued walking, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, he'd catch a glimpse of the figure. A shadowy form just out of sight, always moving when he wasn't looking directly at it. After hours of hiking, Ryan's legs grew heavy, and the trail seemed never-ending. He checked his phone, but it had no signal. As the sun began to set, panic set in. He turned to head back, but the trail had changed. The trees, the rocks, everything looked different. It was as if the forest itself had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. Desperate, Ryan retraced his steps, but every turn led him deeper into the woods. The figure appeared again, this time closer, lingering just beyond the trees. Ryan ran, his heart pounding in his chest, but the trail had disappeared entirely. He was completely lost. As night fell, Ryan collapsed in exhaustion. The figure was closer now, standing in the darkness, watching. Ryan called out again, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. The figure took a step toward him, then another and another. The next morning, a group of hikers found Ryan's abandoned backpack near the trailhead, but there was no sign of him. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but Ryan was never found. The locals claimed he had taken the Lost Path, a trail known for making people disappear without a trace.